Focus looks dangerous, and self-control looks like a classified skill. You never said you were special. You just stopped playing the game the way everyone else was taught to play. I'll do this in eyes measured. Analytical lecture, like tone-rooted in psychology and responsibility, without referencing or imitating any specific person directly. And I'll keep it realistic, grounded, and uninterrupted by headings or wrap-ups. Silence is not the absence of action, and it is certainly not weakness. In fact, silence is often what remains when impulsive behavior has been disciplined out of a person. Most people speak because they are anxious. They fill space because uncertainty terrifies them. They narrate their intentions because they want reassurance that they exist and that they are being acknowledged. Silence, on the other hand, requires the capacity to tolerate tension without immediately discharging it, and that alone places you in a very small minority of people. When you are silent, you are forced to listen, and listening is not passive. It is an active, cognitively demanding process that requires attention, memory, and restraint. You are collecting information while others are broadcasting their insecurities. You are mapping the environment while they are trying to dominate it verbally. This asymmetry matters because the person who knows more than they reveal holds an advantage that is both psychological and practical. Silence also interrupts predictability. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, and conversation is one of the easiest ways to become predictable. When you explain yourself too early, you allow others to categorize you, dismiss you, or manipulate you. Silence denies them that shortcut. It forces them to confront ambiguity, and ambiguity is uncomfortable. In that discomfort, people project their own assumptions, fears, and expectations onto you, often revealing far more about themselves than you ever could by speaking. There is also a moral dimension to silence that is often ignored. Speaking carelessly spreads chaos. Words shape perception, and perception shapes behavior. If you speak without precision, without responsibility, you introduce unnecessary disorder into the social structure around you. Strategic silence is a way of refusing to add noise when clarity is not yet possible. It is the decision to wait until your words can actually aim at truth rather than at relief. Silence disciplines emotion. When something provokes you and you respond immediately, you are being governed by the stimulus rather than by your values. The pause created by silence gives your higher cognitive functions time to come online. It allows judgment to override reflex. Over time, this rewires your relationship with stress. You become someone who does not need to discharge emotion publicly in order to survive it internally. People misunderstand this and assume silence means disengagement. Often it means the opposite. It means you are engaged enough to take the situation seriously. You are treating the moment as something that deserves accuracy rather than theatrics. That seriousness is unsettling to people who rely on emotional displays to maintain control because silence does not give them the feedback loop they need. Strategic silence also signals self-respect. If you value your words, you do not spend them cheaply. You do not argue every point, correct every error, or defend yourself against every accusation. You recognize that some battles are won by refusing to enter the arena at all. Over time, this changes how others treat you. They listen more carefully when you finally do speak, because they have learned that your words are not filler. At a deeper level, silence is how order is constructed internally. When the mind is constantly verbalizing, it cannot properly integrate experience. Silence allows reflection, and reflection is how meaning is extracted from suffering, from failure, from uncertainty. Without that process, people remain reactive, brittle, and resentful. Those who master silence are not cold. They are regulated. They are not passive. They are deliberate. They have learned that power does not announce itself, that confidence does not rush, and that the ability to remain quiet Emotional control under pressure is not about suppressing feeling, because suppression eventually fails, and when it fails, it does so catastrophically. It is about ordering emotion so that it serves perception rather than distorting it. Under pressure, the nervous system prepares the body for threat, and that preparation is ancient, fast, and blunt. Heart rate rises, attention narrows, and the mind searches desperately for certainty. If you have not trained yourself, that state will decide for you what matters and how you respond, usually in ways that feel justified in the moment and regrettable afterward. Pressure exposes hierarchy within the mind. When stress hits, whatever has been practiced most takes control. If you have practiced panic, excuse-making, or aggression, those will surface immediately. If you have practiced restraint, observation, and delayed response, those will emerge instead. Emotional control, then, is not something you improvise when things go wrong. It is something you install long before you are tested, through repetition, responsibility, and voluntary exposure to difficulty. People often confuse emotional control with emotional numbness. That confusion is dangerous. Numbness dulls perception and reduces adaptability. Control sharpens perception. A controlled individual still feels fear, anger, and doubt, but those emotions are interpreted as data rather than commands. Fear becomes information about risk. Anger becomes information about violated boundaries. Doubt becomes information about incomplete understanding. The emotion is allowed to exist without being allowed to rule. Under pressure, time feels compressed. Decisions feel urgent, even when they are not. Emotional control stretches subjective time. The pause between stimulus and response widens just enough for choice to appear. That pause is where character lives. Without it, behavior is automatic, and automatic behavior cannot be moral, because it is not chosen. This is why responsibility is inseparable from emotional regulation. If you believe your actions matter, you are motivated to govern yourself carefully. If you believe nothing is truly your fault, emotion becomes an excuse rather than a signal. Pressure reveals this instantly. The person who explodes under stress is often someone who has quietly rehearsed the idea that their feelings justify their behavior. There is also a social dimension. In high-pressure environments, emotional volatility spreads. One uncontrolled individual destabilizes the entire group. Calm, on the other hand, is contagious in a different way. When someone remains composed while others panic, it reorganizes the emotional hierarchy of the room. People look to that person not because they are dominant, but because they are reliable. Reliability under pressure is rare, and rarity is respected, whether people admit it or not. Emotional control also protects perception from narrative collapse. Under stress, people tell themselves stories to reduce uncertainty. These stories are often simplistic and blame-oriented. They divide the world into heroes and villains, excuses and justifications. A regulated mind resists that temptation. It tolerates complexity. It accepts partial responsibility, even when it would be easier to externalize blame. That acceptance stabilizes identity, because identity built on excuses cannot survive sustained pressure. Training emotional control requires voluntary discomfort. You must place yourself in situations where pressure is real but manageable, and then practice staying oriented. This might mean physical discipline, intellectual challenge, or social confrontation handled without theatrics. Each time you remain composed, you reinforce the neural pathways that make composure more likely next time. Over years, this compounds into a temperament that others interpret as confidence, even when the internal experience includes fear. What people often admire as toughness is actually regulation. It is the ability to keep perception accurate when the cost of accuracy is discomfort. It is the refusal to let emotion collapse the future into the present moment. Under pressure, the controlled individual does not become smaller. They become more precise, more attentive, more accountable. and more capable of acting in accordance with what they have decided actually matters. Discipline over impulse is the difference between a life that is shaped deliberately and a life that is merely reacted into existence. Impulse is fast, emotionally gratifying, and persuasive in the short term, but it is blind to consequence. Discipline is slower, often uncomfortable, and rarely dramatic, but it has a relationship with the future that impulse cannot comprehend. When people choose impulse repeatedly, they are not choosing freedom. They are choosing to be governed by whatever stimulus happens to be loudest in the moment. The nervous system is designed to respond quickly to immediate threats, not to build meaningful lives across decades. That mismatch creates a problem. Modern life constantly provokes impulse without presenting clear danger. And if you do not impose structure voluntarily, your behavior will be dictated by appetite, mood, and convenience. Discipline is the corrective mechanism. It is the conscious decision to bind yourself to a pattern of behavior that you have judged to be worthwhile, even when every short-term signal argues against it. People often assume discipline is about denial, but that is a shallow interpretation. Discipline is about prioritization. It is the ability to subordinate a lesser desire to a greater aim. The impulsive person asks, "What do I want right now?" The disciplined person asks, "What do I want my life to look like? And what does that require of me today?" That shift in questioning changes everything. It moves decision-making out of the emotional present and into a value-based hierarchy. Impulse feels honest because it is immediate, but honesty without responsibility is destructive. If every feeling were acted upon, social order would collapse. Civilization itself is built on the agreement that not every impulse deserves expression. Discipline is the internalization of that agreement. It is how order is maintained within the individual, so that it does not have to be imposed constantly from the outside. Under pressure, impulse becomes even more seductive. Stress narrows attention and amplifies emotional urgency. The desire to escape discomfort pushes people toward shortcuts, excuses, and self-sabotaging relief. Discipline resists that collapse. It keeps behavior aligned with long-term goals even when emotional bandwidth is reduced. That alignment is not rigid, it is adaptive. But it does not abandon principle simply because the situation is unpleasant. There is also a deep psychological stability that emerges from disciplined behavior. When you consistently act in accordance with your stated values, you become predictable to yourself. That predictability generates trust, and self-trust is foundational. Without it, confidence is performative and fragile. With it, confidence is quiet and durable. You know what you will do when things are difficult, because you have rehearsed it when they were not. Discipline also reduces internal conflict. Impulse-driven lives are chaotic internally, full of regret, rationalization, and self-criticism. Each impulsive act demands a story afterward to justify it. Discipline removes the need for those stories. The behavior itself becomes the justification. That simplicity frees cognitive resources for more meaningful pursuits, such as problem-solving, creativity, and responsibility. Many people wait to feel motivated before acting. That is another form of impulse dependence. Motivation is unreliable because it is emotional. Discipline does not wait for motivation. It generates it retroactively. Action precedes feeling, not the other way around. When you act responsibly, motivation often follows, because the brain rewards coherence between values and behavior. Discipline should not be confused with harshness. It is not self-punishment. It is self-respect enacted over time. It is the recognition that the future version of yourself is worth protecting from the short-sighted demands of the present moment. When discipline becomes habitual, impulse does not disappear, but it loses its authority. Desire becomes a suggestion rather than a command, and behavior becomes an expression of choice rather than compulsion. Thinking ahead rather than reacting is a fundamental cognitive shift that separates those who are governed by circumstance from those who shape it. Reaction is immediate and emotionally compelling. It feels necessary because it is fast, and speed creates the illusion of competence. But reaction is usually an answer to the past, not a preparation for the future. When you are constantly reacting, you are always one step behind, responding to conditions you did not choose and outcomes you did not anticipate. The human brain evolved to react quickly to danger, and that capacity is essential for survival. The problem arises when that same reactive machinery is applied to complex, long-term situations that require planning, restraint. In those cases, reaction becomes a liability. It collapses time, forcing you to treat long-term consequences as if they were irrelevant or non-existent. Thinking ahead stretches time back open, allowing the future to exert influence on present behavior. Planning is not prediction. It is not about knowing exactly what will happen. It is about constructing a framework flexible enough to accommodate uncertainty without falling apart. When you think ahead, you identify aims, constraints, and values, and then you orient your actions accordingly. This orientation provides stability under stress because you are not inventing your response in the moment. You are selecting from a set of principles you have already considered. Reaction is often driven by emotion, particularly fear and resentment. These emotions narrow attention and push behavior toward immediate relief. Thinking ahead requires the capacity to tolerate delayed gratification and unresolved tension. It demands that you accept uncertainty without trying to extinguish it through impulsive action. That tolerance is a learned skill, and it develops through repeated exposure to situations where restraint is chosen over reaction. People who think ahead are often misinterpreted as slow or detached. But what is actually happening is depth. They are running multiple scenarios internally, weighing trade-offs, and considering second and third order consequences. They are asking not only what will happen next, but what will happen after that, and who will bear the cost. This kind of thinking is cognitively expensive, which is why it is rare. Most people conserve mental energy by reacting to the most salient stimulus and moving on. There is also an ethical dimension to foresight. When you act without considering the future, you externalize cost. Someone else pays later for your momentary relief. Thinking ahead is a form of moral responsibility because it acknowledges that your actions ripple outward in time and affect people who are not present to defend themselves. That includes your future self, who will inherit the consequences of today's decisions without having had a vote in making them. Thinking ahead stabilizes identity. If your behavior is consistently oriented toward a future you find meaningful, your sense of self becomes coherent. Reaction fragments identity because each situation pulls a different version of you to the surface. Over time, this fragmentation leads to confusion and resentment. A future-oriented framework integrates behavior across contexts, making you more consistent under varying conditions. In social environments, the difference between reacting and thinking ahead becomes immediately visible under pressure. When conflict arises, reactive individuals escalate. They say things they cannot unsay and commit themselves to positions they did not fully consider. Those who think ahead escalate strategically, not out of weakness, but because they are aware of downstream consequences. They understand that winning the moment can mean losing the relationship, the reputation, or the larger objective. Training foresight requires deliberate practice. You must slow your responses, reflect on past failures, and analyze how small decisions compound over time. This process can be uncomfortable because it reveals how often reaction has undermined your stated goals. But that discomfort is informative. It points precisely to where growth is needed. When thinking ahead becomes habitual, reactivity no longer dominates behavior. Emotion still arises, but it is contextualized within a broader. The power of restraint is often misunderstood because it looks like inaction from the outside. In reality, restraint is one of the most active psychological processes a person can engage in. It requires awareness of impulse, evaluation of consequence, and the deliberate choice to delay or redirect behavior. That sequence is demanding, and most people avoid it because reacting feels easier and more authentic. But authenticity without restraint is not virtue. It is exposure of untrained instinct. Restraint begins with the recognition that not every urge deserves expression. Human beings are not defined by the impulses they experience, but by the actions they choose to permit. Anger, desire, fear, and ambition arise automatically, but they are raw materials, not instructions. The restrained individual understands this distinction. They do not identify completely with the emotion of the moment. Instead, they observe it, measure it against their values, and decide whether acting on it would move them closer to or further from what they are trying to build. There is a neurological reality beneath this. The capacity for restraint is tied to higher order cognitive functions that regulate behavior across time. When restraint is exercised, those systems strengthen. When it is neglected, impulse gains authority. Over time, this becomes a feedback loop. A person who consistently practices restraint becomes increasingly capable of it, while a person who habitually indulges impulse finds restraint progressively more difficult, until even minor provocations trigger disproportionate responses. Restraint is also closely tied to dignity. When you restrain yourself, you signal that you are not easily controlled by external stimuli. You are not dragged into conflict by provocation or manipulated by flattery. This does not mean you are passive or submissive. It means you choose the terrain on which you engage. That choice is a form of power, because power is not merely the ability to act, but the ability to decide when action is necessary. In social dynamics, restraint often shifts the balance without a word being spoken. When one person escalates emotionally and the other remains composed, the emotional hierarchy changes. The restrained individual appears larger, more stable, and more authoritative, even if they hold no formal power. People intuitively trust those who can govern themselves, because self-governance is the foundation of all other forms of responsibility. Restraint also protects meaning. Many actions that feel satisfying in the moment undermine long-term purpose. Speaking impulsively can damage relationships. Acting on resentment can corrode character. Indulging every desire fragments attention and weakens commitment. Restraint acts as a filter that preserves what matters by preventing momentary emotion from hijacking direction. It is not repression, it is alignment. There is discomfort in restraint, and that discomfort is precisely why it works. When you resist an impulse, you feel the cost immediately. When you indulge it, the cost is deferred and often invisible at first. Restraint is a willingness to bear short-term discomfort to avoid long-term chaos. That willingness reflects a belief in the future, and people who do not believe their future matters rarely restrain themselves. Restraint also sharpens judgment. When you slow down enough to not act immediately, you create space for perception. You notice nuance. You see alternatives. You recognize when a situation does not require your involvement at all. Many conflicts persist only because someone refuses to restrain their need to win, to be right, or to be seen. The restrained individual steps out of that cycle, conserving energy for situations where action is truly consequential. Over time, restraint becomes identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who is not ruled by circumstance. That self-concept stabilizes behavior even further. You no longer restrain yourself constantly through force of will. The impulse itself weakens because it is no longer rewarded. What remains is a person who acts selectively, speaks carefully, and moves with intention, someone whose presence carries weight not because they dominate, but because they are governed from within. Letting results speak instead of words is a commitment to reality over narrative. Words are cheap in comparison to outcomes. Anyone can explain intentions, justify failures, or construct a convincing story about who they are and what they plan to do. Results, however, exist outside explanation. They are stubborn, measurable, and resistant to spin. When you allow results to represent you, you submit yourself to a standard that cannot be negotiated with rhetoric. Human beings are remarkably skilled at using language to protect their self-image. When actions fall short, words rush in to soften the blow. Excuses, rationalizations, and promises of future effort fill the gap between who someone wants to be and what they have actually done. This creates a dangerous illusion of progress without transformation. Talking about change feels like movement, but it does not reorganize behavior. Results do that because results require sustained action across time. There is a psychological cost to excessive explanation. Every time you explain instead of act, you train yourself to believe that intention is equivalent to execution. Over time, this erodes self-respect. You begin to sense the discrepancy between your words and your outcomes. And that discrepancy produces internal tension. Many people resolve that tension by doubling down on narrative rather than correcting behavior, which leads to cynicism, bitterness, and distrust, both of others and of themselves. Letting results speak imposes discipline on speech. When you know that your words will be evaluated against what you actually produce, you become more precise. You promise less. You claim less. You avoid grand declarations because you understand the weight they carry. This restraint is not humility as performance. It is humility enforced by contact with reality. You learn that credibility is accumulated slowly and destroyed quickly, and that the most reliable way to maintain it is to let your actions accumulate quietly. There is also an ethical clarity that comes with this orientation. Words can be used to manipulate perception, but results expose impact. You may believe your intentions are good, but outcomes reveal whether those intentions were competent. This distinction matters because good intentions, without effective action, still produce harm. Letting results speak forces you to confront the difference between meaning well and doing well, and that confrontation is uncomfortable but necessary. In competitive or high responsibility environments, results reorganize social hierarchies more reliably than charisma or confidence. People eventually stop listening to those who talk without delivering. Conversely, they begin to pay attention to those who produce consistently, even if those individuals are quiet or socially unremarkable. Competence creates gravity. It pulls attention toward itself without demanding it. This approach also protects against resentment. When you focus on outcomes rather than recognition, you are less dependent on external validation. You do not need constant affirmation because the evidence of your effort is tangible. This independence stabilizes motivation. You work because the work matters, not because you need be seen working. That orientation is resilient under criticism and indifferent to praise, both of which can distort behavior when they become primary incentives. Letting results speak also clarifies priorities. Time and energy are finite, and results reveal where they are actually being invested. If the outcomes you care about are not materializing, the problem is not a lack of explanation. It is a misalignment between stated values and enacted behavior. Results function as feedback, not as judgment. They tell you what is happening whether you like it or not, and they do so without malice. There is a particular confidence that emerges from this way of being. It is not loud. It does not seek attention. It is grounded in evidence rather than assertion.